Good morning. My name is Sarah Bone. I'm the director of the Economic Policy Center and a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring the findings of our report, Work and Economic Insecurity in California. The report, technical appendices, policy brief, and slides from today's briefing can be found for free on our website at ppic.org. Many workers in California do not feel economically secure, despite having stable, even rewarding jobs, and despite living in one of the world's largest and most wealth-producing economies. Understanding what policy solutions can meaningfully change the economic prospects of Californians is the focus of the PPIC Economic Policy Center. To shed light on current challenges, in this report, we synthesize a wide range of statewide data and highlight perspectives directly from workers across the state who participated in focus groups in the summer of 2025. The research and this event are supported with funding from the Blue Shield of California Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation, who we are so grateful for their generous support. For today's program, my co-author Sean Kremen, research associate at PPIC's Economic Policy Center, will present some of the key findings from our report. Then Sean will be joined by myself and our co-author Tess Thorman for a discussion of key takeaways and to answer any questions that you have. To that end, if you do have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And we thank you, those of you who sent questions in advance when you registered for this event. We look forward to getting to those during the Q&A portion as well. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And now I'd like to invite my colleague Sean to join us for today's presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And good morning, everyone. My name is Sean Kremen, and I'm a research associate at PPIC. Let me just get my screen shared. Okay, great. I want to acknowledge that this report was joint work with Sarah and our co-authors, Robert Santiano, Tess Thorman, and Mark Baldassari. Great. Although California is home to one of the largest economies in the world, many workers in the state do not feel economically secure. They're struggling to pay their bills, save for the future, and balance the demands of work and daily life. Recent results from PPIC's statewide survey indicate heightened pessimism about economic opportunity in today's economy. For example, only 3 in 10 Californians believe that the American dream, if you work hard, you'll get ahead, holds true. When asked about the year ahead, about 7 in 10 expect bad times financially. These findings serve as key motivation for this report as we aim to better understand challenges workers face to improve their economic security and their prospects for upward mobility. Work is foundational for many Californians to gain financial stability and provide for themselves and their families. However, many working Californians do not feel financially secure given current economic realities. In this report we're highlighting today, we have the opportunity to combine insights from not only big picture economic data and statewide survey results, but also findings from focus groups that we conducted with working Californians in the summer of 2025. We examined workers' perspectives of their economic security, as well as rising costs of essentials and difficult trade-offs workers need to make when coping with affordability challenges. We also look at ways in which work falls short of helping Californians achieve economic security and opportunities for workers to advance economically, as well as barriers to doing so. So while we draw from representative big picture data on California's workforce, we also include findings from 12 focus groups conducted across 6 regions of the state. We heard from 137 workers in total from diverse demographic, geographic, and political backgrounds working in a variety of industries and occupations. Our focus groups included workers in California who, like 3/4 of the state's workforce, are lower and middle earners earning below about $100,000 per year. Specifically, we collaborated with our partner 7Letter to recruit participants who are working and living in California, but also self-identified as economically insecure. We only included those making between the state's minimum wage of $16.50 an hour up to $40 an hour, all of whom reported that they could not cover their expenses comfortably. Additionally, workers were 25 to 54 years old, spoke English fluently, and we did not speak to any agricultural workers. Though our aim is to better understand the realities of California's workforce writ large, our focus groups were not representative of all lower and middle wage workers in the state. So one objective of our report was to better understand workers' understanding of what it means for them to be economically secure. As a worker living in a coastal county said, financial security means that I can retire comfortably. I'm secure. The word security carries meaning to me, knowing that I can pay all of my bills and tuck some away and have savings. A worker living in Los Angeles County also mentioned that economic security translates more to freedom for them and not worrying about everyday expenses and being able to provide for their daughter. However, we also heard and see signs in the data that Californians are struggling to achieve some key indicators of economic security, such as being able to absorb a financial shock or having control over their finances month to month. PPIC's statewide survey finds that about half of lower income adults say it would be very difficult or impossible to pay for a $1,000 emergency expense. Other PPIC research has found that about a third of California households lack the liquid assets to cover their basic needs for a month without income. We also heard from our focus group participants about the mental and emotional toll of experiencing economic insecurity, describing it as a struggle to stay afloat or keeping them up at night. Across focus groups, many workers mentioned the struggle of trying to make ends meet in the midst of rising costs of basic necessities like housing, food, and utilities, particularly in the years since the COVID-19 pandemic. Rising costs are especially challenging for workers making lower wages who have a more difficult time adjusting to higher costs of essentials, as these make up a larger share of their spending relative to higher wage workers. Many workers we heard from expressed similar sentiments as the San Diego worker who said, I work full-time and I can't afford to live. Workers mentioned rising costs of several items in recent years. Here we highlight two, but we also cover more in our report. Housing and rent in particular were frequently cited as cost burdens, as these generally are the largest expense for many Californians. Since 2019, rent prices have risen across the state, increasing by as high as 40% in the Riverside metro area. Additionally, food prices, which were also frequently cited in our focus groups, increased by about 20 to 30% across the state since 2019. Challenges associated with rising costs of living are forcing workers to make difficult trade-offs in how they allocate their resources and time to balance the demands of work in their daily lives. A common example we heard from workers, particularly those with young children or caring for other dependents, was needing to choose whether to take a full-time job to make more money versus keeping their part-time job and spending more time caring for their children at home to save money on high childcare costs. Many workers we talked to had thought about moving to less expensive areas, including out of state. However, workers had to weigh the potentially lower costs of other areas with staying where they were, closer to local support networks, including family and friends. Workers also had specific challenges when it came to the role of the social safety net in helping them cope with higher costs. One worker enrolled in Medi-Cal discussed wanting to take more hours at work, but not being able to as she would lose her Medi-Cal benefits, which pay for her medication. Lastly, while we don't cover it here, in the report we discuss more about how debt also factors into workers' financial decision-making. Workers discussed how it felt to make these trade-offs in the context of rising costs, particularly when their only option seemed like taking on more work when they were already at capacity. As this worker from LA said, the cost of living is going up, but what we get paid at work is not. We have to pick up different jobs and have no time to recharge or do the basic things to balance out our lives. If I have to push the boulder up the hill, I will, but I don't think any of us should have to live like that. Workers' struggles to achieve economic security are not only a product of current economic challenges like rising costs, but also longer-term shifts in the labor market and the economy. Since 2000, the number of high-wage jobs in the labor market has grown by 60%, and the number of low-wage jobs has grown by 20%. However, while we see this growth in high and low-wage jobs, there's been essentially no growth in middle-wage jobs over this period. This is a particular concern, as research shows that many workers remain stuck in lower-wage jobs over the long haul. Thus, a lack of additional middle-wage jobs potentially cuts off a potential avenue for lower-wage workers to rise up the economic ladder. In addition to stagnating middle-wage jobs, we also discuss more in the report about how the gap in earnings has increased for workers with high earnings compared to workers with middle and lower earnings. We also heard from workers about a variety of current challenges relating to characteristics of their jobs that make it difficult to improve their earnings and well-being. Although over 8 in 10 Californians report being very or somewhat satisfied in their current jobs, our focus group participants revealed ways in which their jobs may limit their ability to improve their economic circumstances that go beyond simply low pay. First, participants mentioned that part-time or erratic work schedules can limit earnings potential. As a worker we heard from said, "My hours are always changing. One month I might be okay, but the next I might not make enough." Additionally, lower wage jobs tend to be more concentrated in certain industries and occupations. Some felt that there were not as many opportunities to advance in their line of work. Several participants mentioned picking up an additional job or work in the gig economy to supplement their earnings, but said that this can add stress or take away from their leisure and family time. As one worker from a county in the coastal region put it, "Me and all my friends, we buy into the California hustle. If you don't have a side hustle, you can't live here." Lastly, workers mentioned other characteristics of their jobs that made it worthwhile to stay despite earning lower wages. These included having greater autonomy and flexibility in their schedules, healthy workplace culture, opportunities for career advancement in the future, union membership, and benefits such as health insurance. When asked how they might improve their prospects for economic advancement, many workers in our focus groups said they had considered changing jobs, changing careers, starting businesses, or going back to school. Yet few felt confident that they could afford to pursue these strategies or that they would pay off. We found that job or career changes were particularly challenging for workers already in precarious financial situations. Workers mentioned wanting to have a more stable financial footing before introducing additional uncertainty into their lives, which leaves workers in a bind. Research shows that lower wage workers see fewer opportunities for career advancement within their own firm. According to PPIC's statewide survey, 4 in 10 lower and middle wage workers report education and training opportunities at their current jobs, compared to 6 in 10 higher wage workers. Many workers we spoke to are also reluctant to make changes or investments in their future by pursuing further education or job training without certainty that these investments will pay off in the future. Some of these points were summed up by a worker in LA who said, "I've been thinking about making a career shift and getting more training, but you have to sacrifice a lot of your time and your ability to work a normal job. It takes money to make money." Today's uncertain labor market is also exacerbating the potential risks workers face when deciding whether or not to make a change to improve their prospects for upward mobility. The pandemic, inflation in recent years, technological change on the horizon, and recent federal actions continue to shape the current labor market, which now has more unemployed people than job openings. As quit rates remain relatively stable, observers have referred to this labor market as one characterized by job hugging, underscoring the point we heard from focus group participants that it may be difficult to make a change when already in an uncertain situation. We also heard from workers looking for new jobs that the job search process feels increasingly challenging, with a lack of in-person opportunities for connection, like job fairs, and the proliferation of AI in hiring. In closing, we wanted to share some of our high-level takeaways from listening to California's workers. First, many of California's low and middle wage workers are stuck in survival mode. Despite citing certain state policies and programs that are helping, many workers feel they lack a voice in the political and policymaking process. Improving paths for workers to achieve economic security and upward mobility remains a vital challenge and priority for state policymakers to pursue. Lastly, workers struggling to make ends meet feel overlooked by state leaders and want their experiences to be better understood. When asked what they would want to say to government and business leaders in the state, the Central Valley workers said, "Live like we do and just see if you can make it work and see what it feels like. Because until you know how hard it is to live on like $2,000 a month, when rent is like $1,200 to $1,800 and you have kids or dependents, then you can't really conceptualize what people need." With that, if you have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And now I invite my co-authors, Sarah Bone and Tess Thorman, to join me for discussion of additional key takeaways from this report and for our audience Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sean, for summarizing a quite lengthy report in a few minutes. As we wait for questions for the audience to come in, we thought we would hit on a couple discussion topics among this subset of the authors of this report, just to discuss further some of the nuances of what we're seeing in the data. So where I wanted to start is to ask you both kind of what surprised you most about what we heard from focus groups, because we spend a lot of our time at PPIC analyzing data on California's economy and how Californians are doing economically. And this was a really unique opportunity to hear directly from Californians. So maybe Tess, you want to start and share anything that kind of surprised you about the component of this work?
Sure. And thanks, Sean, for the great presentation. Um, I think that, as Sarah mentioned, we spend a lot of time looking at the data and particularly on experiences of poverty in California. And so it was surprising to hear some of the same challenges with affordability for people with pretty low incomes and people with what we would typically consider to be a middle income. We were specifically trying to hear from folks who are experiencing economic insecurity, but to hear kind of the same story from both income groups was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with what Tess is saying on that point. And something else that stood out to us that we're continuing to grapple with is how to reconcile economic data that's showing rising real wages with people's perceptions that prices have actually really greatly outpaced wages, particularly in the years since the pandemic. So national data from the Federal Reserve, shows wages accounting for inflation of real wages growing in recent years. And it actually shows real wages growing more for workers in the bottom half than the top half, though that's been a bit reversing in recent months. Nonetheless, focus group participants we talked to and the general perception is that prices were dramatically outpacing any potential wage gains. So we looked at some research into that, and we see that the strain people are feeling from rising prices seems to be more salient than any gains from rising wages. This is related to the concept of loss aversion. And research also finds that higher than expected inflation can lead to acute feelings of loss and greater negative impacts on people with lower incomes. As I said, they're spending more of their income on these essentials, which we saw had pretty high price growth in recent years. So definitely reconciling that and trying to better understand that was something that stood out to me in this report.
Yeah, definitely a puzzle that many economists have been trying to understand over the past few years with the inflation that we've been through. Um, Sean, maybe we could stay on you for a second because I wanted to dig deeper on what you mentioned during the presentation. You showed a very long-term chart about how job growth has changed across low, middle, and high wage kind of occupations. Would you say that the challenges workers are facing today are new? Like, is it actually harder to make ends meet in California? How would you contrast some of kind of this current situation with that longer trend that you showed us?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's definitely a tough one because in some ways, no, some of the challenges that workers, particularly lower and middle wage workers, are facing are persistent challenges, and they've been shaped by longer term trends in the economy and in the labor market. Some of the challenges we heard about and analyzed in the data over the long run were increasing earnings inequality between high and low wage workers, and also even increasing gaps between higher and middle wage workers. There's also this growing concentration of lower and higher wage jobs and stagnation of middle wage jobs that's manifested over time, which presents a challenge for people, trying to move from a lower wage job up to a middle income job and rise up the economic ladder in that way. So those challenges like that are more perennial. There are definitely some newer challenges, or at least some more salient challenges right now that workers, may not have actually experienced in their lifetimes until recently. One of these, which we've been talking about, is the inflation crisis, which peaked in around 2022, and that was some of the highest levels of inflation we've seen in the last few decades. Obviously, the pandemic plays a role in this, changing the nature of the work for a lot of people. Also, in terms of the labor market in recent years, there was kind of this period called the Great Resignation that followed the pandemic, where more people were quitting or changing jobs at a higher rate. And this just shifted to more of this job hugging labor market where people are kind of staying put, and we're seeing slower job growth within the last year. AI also plays a role in this, and then the proliferation of, how that will change things. About half of Californians workers fear that AI might take jobs in their industry. So I think in some, like a lot of the uncertainty that people are facing right now may be, more of a short-term challenge that wasn't experienced in recent years. So
Yeah, lots of contrasts. I'm feeling like the three of us are relatively optimistic people, but this work is pretty dismal and highlighting a lot of challenges that Californians and really shared challenges with many across the US are feeling in terms of affordability and opportunities. So I thought we could next touch on policy solutions to get to some of like what could actually address this. That was not the main intent of this report. We were elevating kind of a check on how Californians are doing and elevating their voices. But of course, we aim to kind of be able to inform the long-term policy conversation on these key issues. So, what policy issues would you guys highlight about, that you think could most improve worker situations?
I tend to think of this kind of falling into two buckets where there's a short-term improvement and a longer-term improvement. And the short term is kind of what we would think about as in the traditional safety net range, where things like food assistance that gives people essentially cash to cover part of their grocery bill, or, childcare, subsidized childcare can help people afford high quality childcare that kind of meets their family's needs. And then on the other side, when you're thinking about the longer term, um, for many workers, we heard, as Sean mentioned, people were hesitant to maybe go back to school or retrain for a new career because they weren't sure whether that would work out and were kind of nervous about how big of an investment it would be. So policy in that area can be, potentially about making it a smaller investment, making college or other training, more affordable to people who are looking to go back, or making sure that people have the information they need to pick a career, to pick a job, to pick a program that is right for them and understand, kind of how it would impact their finances long term. We did actually ask people about this in this report. We asked workers what they thought about policies that would improve their situations. And across the board, people were really focused on, achieving economic security now, and thinking about kind of the immediate term. Could prices be lower? Could government help stop prices from rising? Could something be more affordable? And oftentimes people talked about that in terms of housing, but it came up in a lot of areas. People talked about healthcare, people talked about wage increases, income supports, they talked about utilities, but it tended to be focused on that short-term picture. Um, and this is kind of workers thinking about the role of policy in their lives, but we know that there's a big role for the economy. So I actually want to turn this back to Sarah to ask, how you think affordability and workers' economic security might change in the year ahead or might not.
Yeah. Well, we are actively looking at data to try to understand that. I wish I had a crystal ball. There's obviously a lot of forecasts out there, and most of them are rather kind of dismal. I mean, in the short run, I would hope for small gains in wages compared with no increase or very slow increases in prices to just make that equation of, what I'm earning versus what I need to pay for, just like pencil out for more people. Unfortunately, I think on both fronts, that's unlikely to be a major kind of valve for California's workers this year because inflation is tempering, at least increases in prices, but it still remains higher than the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. And there's remaining questions about the role of trade policy and how that will continue to kind of fall out. And affect prices for consumers at the end of the day. And on the wage front, the labor market, as Sean mentioned, is growing a lot more slowly. It has been for a few years. And in that environment, when you're in a kind of job hugging where the number of job openings are not as vast as they were a few years ago, it's not an environment where employers really need to compete to hire by increasing wages. I guess the bright spot I would point to is that, by increasing productivity through tools like AI or other kind of building skills, could help wage gains, but that's a little bit more of a longer term conversation or longer term investment, as you were alluding to, Tess. I'm sorry to end that part on a bit of a continued dismal note, but we'll certainly be watching and sharing data through ppic.org about kind of how the economy is doing in the coming months as data becomes available. So we're at 11:25 and we're getting questions from the audience. So I want to kind of get to as many of those as possible. And I'm going to start with one that Tim Rainey submitted before the event. California has the highest rate of poverty in the US. That affordability crisis is not unique to California. Other than the high cost of housing and energy, what factors account for California's highest in the nation poverty rate? Thanks so much for that question, Tim. It actually is largely about housing costs and just like the mechanics of measuring poverty. The California Poverty Measure, which is a tool created by PPIC and the Stanford Center on Poverty, estimates that if all Californians lived in a low-cost county of the state, about like equivalent to living in Fresno, then the poverty rate in the state would be 11.7%. That would be around 40th in the nation instead of around 17%, which is towards the top of the US today. It's not exactly a fair calculation because partially we have higher wages in California because we have higher housing costs, but housing costs loom large in the kind of poverty calculation for sure. I would just add that government supports play a big role, and when you actually measure how people are doing after accounting for the role of government, you see how much, especially during the pandemic, safety net program expansions and direct cash to residents really did affect poverty. In fact, we had the lowest rate of poverty in 2021, I think it was, than we've seen since back to 2010. Okay, sorry, that's a little bit lengthy. I want to make sure we get to as many questions as possible. So let's turn to a question from Mackenzie Richardson. How has access to childcare affected economic instability for workers, particularly those who work on nights and weekends? Sean, Tess, does somebody want to handle that one?
Yeah, I can jump in here to start. And unfortunately, we don't have great information, at least from our focus groups, about exactly when folks were working. So I'm not sure if I can really speak to the nights and weekends part. But we definitely heard from a lot of workers in our focus groups, particularly parents with young children, who specifically mentioned how the high costs of childcare are contributing to their feelings of economic insecurity. And I briefly mentioned in the presentation that working parents are having to make these difficult trade-offs between working more hours to get higher pay or working fewer hours and spending those free hours at home to care for their children and saving money on these childcare costs. I remember one participant in particular who said that they want to work full time, but basically those earnings that what they would make from full-time work would go directly to paying for childcare, so they kind of viewed it as a wash. It's also important to remember, I think there's obviously a gender component to this. We know from PPIC research that mothers of young children are less likely to work than fathers of young children. And again, while we don't have great information on the specific hours that people worked in our focus groups, we did hear a lot about how flexible schedules or hybrid opportunities actually were helpful in people to try to allocate their time and resources and spend more time with their kids. And we talked a little bit about, Tess talked a little bit about policy a couple minutes ago. And from our statewide survey, we know that overwhelming majorities of Californians are in favor of increasing government funding so that childcare programs can be more available for these lower wage and middle wage working parents. And there was a recent PPIC report that has more about California's changing childcare landscape that I want to plug here that you can find on our website.
Yeah, great plug there, Sean. Good work there. Okay, we have a question from Suzanne Reed about how can EDD funding be equitably balanced to support job training for emerging jobs, traditional jobs, and others to support kind of the kind of future work in the economy. I would just say, and Tess and Sean, feel free to jump in too, but initial thoughts are, EDD programs are definitely critical in that space, but I would also point to K-12, community college, higher ed, funding streams and programs, and the work that they do as really critical for kind of meeting the future workforce needs of the state, but also really kind of opening up individual opportunity by building skills and education. Now, I don't have a great answer to say like this is how it should be distributed across kind of maybe emerging areas versus traditional ones, in part because that landscape is going to continue to evolve. We're in a very fast-moving time. So I guess to that end, in our work, we've tried to reiterate the connection of the state's institutions, especially those related to workforce development and education, being connected to the state's employers to have more of a pulse on where things are headed, what kind of skills and opportunities are needed, are available, would be really critical. And as I understand it, the Career Education Master Plan, aims to kind of address some of those issues for the state. So we're hopeful about that, and we're going to definitely be kind of watching this area as a key potential route to mobility for more Californians. Okay, we're going to go just 1 minute over because I want to make sure that we get to this question from Wen Sui, who asked, focus group participants mentioned that earning slightly more can actually make them worse off by disqualifying them from health or food assistance. How can California redesign its benefit programs to ensure that a raise in pay is always a net gain for the worker? Tess, I feel like this is kind of in your wheelhouse. Do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah. I will note first that when we think about California redesigning these programs, one of the big challenges is always that most of California's safety net programs are federal programs, and so the design is really determined there. And what California can do is kind of supplement those programs and try to include additional populations in those ways, but we can't often change the whole design. I think that some of the answer to this question, though, is about the difference between are people who are working, earning slightly more, and then exiting a safety net program and still staying kind of near poverty, or are they earning enough that they are well out of the range of eligibility for that program? And so you could try to supplement a program so that people have a kind of transitional benefit and they have an extra maybe a year of benefits in which hopefully their career moves forward and they have a job that has some upward earning potential. But the other option is to say, while people are working and participating in a safety net program, they get enough support that they get on a career trajectory that would really boost their income in the long term. And I think the question is whether California has the budget to support that, but those are some of the options for how you could try to confront that issue.
Thank you, Tess. And I would definitely recommend to anybody look up Tess's work on many of these safety net programs and how it intersects with work for more details in that space. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us a couple minutes over time. And thank you so much for those questions. We've now reached the end of our program. And thank you again, Tess and Sean, for today's presentation and discussion. I want to thank again our funders, the James Irvine Foundation and Blue Shield of California Foundation, for their generous support. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We would really benefit from your feedback on this event. If you pre-registered for the event, you'll receive an email later today with a link to a short survey. You can also scan the QR code here on your screen and take the survey right now. We really take to heart your feedback, your suggestions, and ideas for our programs. Finally, a recording of today's event will be available on the PPIC website and on our YouTube channel very soon, so you can watch it again, and please share with your network, with anybody who might be interested in this work. Thank you so much again for joining us and for your support of our work at PPIC. Have a wonderful day.